Hi, everyone, and welcome to Storms on the Way. I'm Alistair Stevens, and in this session, our 20th session, Shadow has dinner with Marguerite Olson and reconnects with Sam, runs into Audrey and is thrown unceremoniously in prison, remotely witnesses a harrowing death, then journeys to the center of America to recover the body, and thence to Kentucky to stand in vigil. And if that sounds like a lot, it's because it is. It's because we're going to cover two chapters for this week's reading, chapters 13 and 14. And of course, we didn't completely finish our reading from last time. We still have to cover the interludes too. All of that plus a coming to America. How are we going to cover that in an hour and a half, you ask? With discipline and fortitude, for which I am renowned across the internet, of course. We're going to get right into it. You can contribute live here in the YouTube chat. We have Elizabeth and Kim and Mary, and Princess Ostrich is joining us for the first time in quite a while, and Aaron is here, and Skipa is joining us. We've got a lot of great people here offering great insight and commentary. You can also contribute both during the live broadcast and after the fact on Twitter using the hashtag StormsOTW. I will see that unfolding here on the left-hand side of my screen. Pretty great to have you all here with me today. Discipline and fortitude, yes. I meant what I said, and I said what I meant. Why, you might ask, are we accelerating our pace through American Gods? Well, in part, it's because this part of the book, kind of taken in its entirety, certainly the interludes specifically, but then both chapter 13 and 14 function as a very powerful turning point in the structure of this story. Ordinarily, and I've been thinking about this a lot the more closely I read American Gods. Ordinarily, this kind of turning point is what we call a midpoint. It should fall right slap bang in the middle of the second act. This is the point in which the expanding conflict of the first half of the story changes direction. It becomes a narrowing conflict. Basically, at this point, we stop introducing new characters, and we stop adding new threads to the tapestry, and we start resolving some of the outstanding storylines. And that is absolutely true of this entire sequence, between the interludes in which we learn that the war has really begun, and then, of course, the death of Wednesday and Shadow's Vigil. We are turning the corner into the back half of the book, but by the end of the sequence, we're at the end of chapter 14 in a 20-chapter novel. And that got me thinking about the structure of American Gods as a whole and how strange it is, how odd it is. It has a wildly elongated first act. We spend a lot of time setting up the conflict, setting up the characters. We spend a lot of time in Shadow's company without terribly much happening. And then we kind of circle back around and do that again. We get another perspective on Shadow, this time in the guise of Mike Ainsel in Lakeside. And that serves once more to give us a perspective on who this guy is, on, to some degree, what this guy is. By the time we hit this turning point, though, it can feel as though we've built a lot of foundational work. We've built our scaffolding. We're ready for the plot to now happen. We're ready for things to kick into high gear. And it feels as though we're in a car that never really starts. And I think that that's a fair criticism of, if not the Lakeside chapters, then at least the action that takes place alongside Lakeside, the action that takes place as Shadow is plucked from this mundane life by Wednesday. And the more I think about it, the more I wish that we had pulled Lakeside earlier in the book. If we had somehow managed to have that happening alongside, not necessarily the House on the Rock, but at least the aftermath of the House on the Rock, I feel as though the book would hold together, the pace of the book would hold together a little better. But be that as it may, this is our primary turning point. This is the midpoint of the story, and things really do accelerate from this point on. So on the one hand, we're going to accelerate our coverage of American Gods just because there's going to be more plot and necessarily a little less depth for us to explore. We're going to be able to cover more ground more quickly. But we also have an external pressure applied here to Storms on the Way, and that, let me share this slide with you, the very exciting announcement in case you missed it. Dear Mr. Potter is returning for a third season on August the 8th. On August the 8th, the week after we finish Storms on the Way, we're going to launch ourselves into the third Harry Potter novel, Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. I can't wait. I don't think this is going to spoil anyone's enjoyment of this book if I tell you up front, this is my favorite Harry Potter book. This is certainly my favorite Harry Potter movie, and we're going to talk about that too right at the end. Dear Mr. Potter's third season is going to be a 12-week series. It's going to take us 11 weeks to get through the entirety of the book, and then an additional week to talk about the movie. So that begins on August 8th, and we have to wrap up Storms on the Way before then. So we are going to cover 2 chapters a week every Tuesday here on Storms on the Way, and then we have one additional Sunday session right at the end, the Sunday before the 8th, so that would be the 6th. Math fans can corroborate that, I'm sure. August 6th, we're going to have a special finale episode of Storms on the Way, in which we talk about the 2 short stories which take place after the events of the book. I will have links to those in the show notes accompanying the podcast version of this lecture. Let me see where we are here. 8 out of 8 for a 7-book series, says Aaron. Lovely. Yes, yes. Yeah, exactly. This is where the road trip starts being the chase, says Aaron. You're absolutely right. That turning point that I described is within the frame of American Gods, and this is so often the case, the point at which our purposelessness, the point at which our exploration and discovery starts becoming a quest. We're actually moving toward now, rather than simply accumulating more characters and more plots and more, threads here as a part of the story. Yeah. Kate Bennett says on Twitter, POA is the best HP book. Obviously, I am inclined to agree. I respect other opinions. I respect divergent opinions on that score, but it is certainly my favorite. I would also argue, coincidentally, that it is the best. Yes. Princess Ostrich says in the YouTube chat, I think this is why the other Neil Gaiman books never worked for me. They lack this middle part and only have the world building and then the ambiguous showdown. That's absolutely fair, I think. One of the things that sets, to be fair, a lot of people go to Gaiman for the world building and then the ambiguous showdown. That's the hallmark of his work, that combination of that magical realist and immediate establishment of a world like our own, but also unlike our own, and then a climax that speaks perhaps more to theme than the actual resolution of the plot. A lot of people go to Gaiman specifically for that, but I do think it's fair to say that American Gods stands apart from his other work because, for all that I can lament its somewhat sluggish structure in the first half, obviously, I really enjoyed the first half of the book, you guys, but from a plot perspective, it isn't perhaps quite as disciplined as it could be. For all that structure is less tight than we would want it to be, for all that this book is arguably 2 chapters too long, that there is some stuff in there toward the end of the first act that we could tighten, that we could compress, that we could combine with other elements in order to make it a little more effective. I think that American Gods holds itself apart from the rest of Gaiman's work by virtue of that structure. And I think that road trip structures in general are more willful, more prone to sliding into the weeds than this structure is. So what Gaiman has done in the pages of American Gods is not simple. He has taken a very ambiguous structure, very ambiguous world building, a host of ambiguous characters, ambitious world building, I should say, and a host of ambiguous characters, and managed to deliver on those, I think, extremely well. This is not to say that American Gods is not just a knockout book, because I genuinely believe that it is. I genuinely believe that it's an important book. I genuinely believe that it's a seminal book, but that doesn't mean that it's perfect. And it is certainly true that at the start of chapter 14, which we'll discuss a little bit, we can feel again the pace starting to slow. We're not perhaps quite where we want to be. Let me catch up here. We're talking a lot about Prisoner of Azkaban here. And Becca Ellis says, the short stories kill my heart. I must admit, Becca, it has been a long time since I read either of the short stories. And I remember being somewhat haunted, particularly by Monarch of the Glen. We'll see how that works out when we get there again. I'm looking forward very much to reading them and kind of picking up the continuing threads of American Gods as we move forward. And of course, it's entirely possible that this story is not done. It's entirely possible that the current favor in which American Gods finds itself within the landscape of our shared pop culture will actually lead Gaiman to tell at least one more story, if not an entirely different novel. He has talked about writing another American Gods novel, and certainly we could, I guess from a thematic point of view, we could look at Anansi Boys 2, which is not coexistent with American Gods and yet is not incompatible with American Gods either. Like many of Gaiman's works, it shares common themes that allow you to kind of connect these 2 books together, even though they are very different and have very different purposes and very different focuses. Yeah. And Aaron makes an excellent point here in the YouTube chat too. I remember that American Gods was much faster paced on my first read, but that wasn't the author's preferred edition and much shorter. I think the author's preferred edition comes in at like 5% longer, but that 5%, I think, really does slow the pace. And it's difficult to be critical of that 5%, honestly, because contained within that 5% is some of my favorite stuff in the book. Some of the most effective and evocative prose is within that 5%. So argue that Gaiman did the wrong thing by adding back all of that cut material, but it does affect the pace. Yes. All right. Speaking of pace, let's get into it. We are going to talk first about our interludes, and the first interlude that we get, well, we begin with the announcement that the war has begun, and we get a very brief encapsulation of terrible things happening, mysterious things happening all across the United States. The war between the gods has begun. It is no longer a Cold War. Now action is actually being taken, and that action is never more definitive than it is in the case of Bilquis. The Queen of Sheba, half demon, they said, on her father's side, witch woman, wise woman, and queen, who ruled Sheba when Sheba was the richest land there ever was, when its spices and its gems and scented woods were taken by boat and camelback to the corners of the earth, who was worshipped even when she was alive, worshipped as a living goddess by the wisest of kings, stands on the sidewalk of Sunset Boulevard at 2 a.m., staring blankly out at the traffic like a slutty plastic bride on a black and neon wedding cake. She stands as if she owns the sidewalk and the night that surrounds her. When someone looks straight at her, her lips move as if she's talking to herself. When men in cars drive past her, she makes eye contact and she smiles. She ignores the men who walk past her on the sidewalk. It happens. People walk everywhere, even in West Hollywood. She ignores them, does her best to pretend that they are not there. It's been a long night. It's been a long week and a long 4,000 years. She is proud that she owes nothing to anyone. The other girls on the street, they have pimps, they have habits, they have children, they have people who take what they make, not her. There is nothing holy left in her profession, not anymore. So we must, of course, remind ourselves, particularly for those of us who have been watching American Gods, the Stars adaptation, that this is only our second glimpse of Bilquis. And this will, of course, be our final glimpse of Bilquis. This is her death scene where she dies unceremoniously at the hands of the technical boy, at the wheels, I suppose, rather disgustingly, of the technical boy. The conflict that we see here is between old gods and new, but it would be too simple to cast it in those terms, particularly here within the pages of the novel. Look at that first paragraph. We get this expansive, we get this Gaiman prose. We've talked before about how his prose will sometimes expand beyond the constraints of grammar. This is not technically correct prose, and it doesn't need to be, because what we get instead is a cavalcade. We get a tidal wave of impressionistic sense. We get the idea that this is who Bilquis is. The Queen of Sheba, half demon, they said, on her father's side. Witch woman, wise woman, queen, who ruled Sheba when Sheba was the richest land there ever was. We get detail after detail after detail, who was worshipped even when she was alive, worshipped as a living goddess by the wisest of kings, stands on the sidewalk of Sunset Boulevard at 2 a.m. We collapse into the present tense. We collapse into mundanity, but we do it within the same frame because there is here a continuity of experience. We are not moving from the Queen of Sheba, Bilquis herself, into another character, the way that we so often do when we collapse from that high register into the low. Here we are staying with the same wounded and exhausted woman. She has had this long experience. And then we get the shift in language. We get the shift in tone here. Who was worshipped even when she was alive, worshipped as a living goddess by the wisest of kings, now stands on the sidewalk like a slutty plastic bride on a black and neon wedding cake. We get that collapse not just of tone, not just of style, not just of rhetoric, but of imagery, of dignity. We are left here without any false impression. We cannot find any dignity in what Bilquis is doing. She rejects that notion outright because we are in, we should note here, her POV. This is her account. No disembodied narrator is telling us about Sheba back in the day. Bilquis is, in a sense, giving us this sense. And she is blurred between her memory and her current experience. When someone looks straight at her, her lips move as if she's talking to herself. And I wonder, with heartbreak, what it is that she is saying to herself at that point. I wonder if she is reminding herself of who she is. I wonder if she is offering the prayers that they will not offer to her yet. It has been a long night. It has been a long week, a long 4,000 years. She is proud that she owes nothing to anyone. She is finding here some fragment of dignity. She is finding here some fragment of pride, some fragment of, crucially, identity here in this moment. She owes nothing to anyone. She doesn't have a pimp. She doesn't have a habit. She doesn't have children. And yet, there is nothing holy left in her profession. Not anymore. So even as she is doing this thing, it has been stripped of its value. It has been stripped of its sanctity. It has been stripped essentially of its nature. She is wordlessly, tunelessly, moving through the motions, moving through the ritual. She is surviving, but no more than that. And in that sense, of course, we can draw a direct line back to Chernobog, back to Wednesday himself, it might be argued. This is the fate of the old gods in the new world. The meaning has been lost. And if we're lucky, the practice remains, but sometimes the practice doesn't even remain. Sometimes the ritual doesn't even remain. Yeah. Oh, Aaron is calling back to the critical reading. Yes, as Skipa said, she's singing the Song of Solomon to hold on to herself. The Song of Solomon here, absolutely crucial. Yes, this is what Bilquis is singing. She is, in a sense, I was going to say seeking to sanctify, but I'm not sure that's actually true. She is reminding herself of the sanctity of the relationships between men and women, the relationships of human beings to sensuality, in fact. She is reminding herself of that thing, of that essential truth, that truth which has now been lost because there is nothing holy left in her profession. Aaron is calling out here a reference from the critical reading class that I gave last night, in which we were talking about Ode on a Grecian Urn by Keats, in which he collapses his rhetoric down to the phrase cold pastoral, which is a wonderfully evocative phrase. But Aaron here is making the argument that Gaiman's collapse of the paean to the goddess to harsh reality is brilliant, way better than Keats's cold pastoral. I would argue that his intent is a little different, and by embodying the goddess here, by making us emotionally and personally connected to Bilquis in this moment, he has an easier time of it than Keats had. But I certainly see your point. I certainly see your point. Yes. All right. Princess Ostrich says in the YouTube chat, this is so important to contrast with the other old gods, where until now we have understood their crisis mostly as a loss of power, not a loss of identity, which is even worse. Princess Ostrich, you are right on the money there. Yes, and calls out too. Well, we saw that with Easter, but there it was a joke. I understand that too. I think you're absolutely on the money. Bilquis is different. And one of the ways in which Bilquis is different is that her worship, her relationship with her worshippers, her power, her status as a goddess was an emergent property of her humanity. Bilquis was human. She remembers the time back when she was alive, worshipped still, a living goddess, but then she transcended life. She transcended mortality, and that apparently is a thing that can happen. We've seen now a few examples of that happening. Presumably, that is what has happened to Jesus within the frame of American gods. We get these mortal beings who, through the power of story, through the power of worship, ascend, transcend. And Bilquis has done that. But when we see characters ascend, when we see people ascend to this higher state, they are tied to their origin story. They are tied to their mortal frame in a way that gods of story and myth, like, to pick a name at random, Odin, are not. Odin is always the story, but Bilquis is not. And she still has to observe that ritual, as I said, even when the meaning, even when the sanctity has been lost. I didn't pull a slide for the death of Bilquis because nobody needs that in their life, you guys. Nobody needs to revisit that. It is heartbreaking. It is tragic. And I would draw your attention, just if you're going to reread this passage, possibly none of you ever will because it is so difficult, but if you're ever going to reread the passage, please pay careful attention to Bilquis slowly reciting the Song of Solomon to herself and Technical Boy butchering Madonna. That is the counterpoint here. One of these things, and it's not just about antiquity, and it's not just about even literary merit. What it's about is fundamental human truth. What it is about is who human beings are. And it is no coincidence here that Bilquis, as wounded as she is, as exhausted as she is, as ground down by the necessity of continued existence over 4,000 years in which she has been all but forgotten, even there, she is more connected with human beings than the Technical Boy is. And we can begin, as we move through these chapters in particular, as our understanding of gods begins somewhat to fragment, and certainly as we continue to turn our focus away from gods to people. We'll talk about our Coming to America sequence shortly. As we continue to do that, we have to watch the way in which the new gods interact with human beings versus the way that the old gods interact with human beings, even when the old gods are contemptuous, even when the old gods are critical, even when the old gods are actively manipulative. There is a personal connection there that is absent from the new gods. So it's not simply the case that the gods are at war and it doesn't really matter which team wins because human beings will still be their focus, will still be necessary. I mean, in a sense, that's true. But in another greater sense, the old gods recognize our humanity in a way that the new gods do not. And that is something, of course, of which we should be fearful. That is not to say that the old gods are necessarily great all the time either, but given the choice, I would rather be, you know, in dire circumstances and human than not. Let me see here. Yes, I hate technical boys so much for this, says Becca Eller. Yes, yes, good. All right, let's... Yeah, Aaron makes an interesting point here. He says, I'm in Portland, some friends/acquaintances with a few ladies that dance for side money. Their brilliant conversations would be great to incorporate. Yes. Is there a sense in which Bilquis's state here can be extrapolated into a critical perspective on sex work? I don't think that there is. I have seen that critique online, and I've received a couple of emails about it. And I'm just not sure that I really engage with that, because Gaiman is not drawing too broad a parallel here. He's not talking about sex work in general. He's talking about Bilquis specifically. And what is hurting Bilquis is not the economic transaction. The economic transaction actually seems to be working out fairly well for her. She seems to be doing okay at this. What is hurting Bilquis is the absence of worship. And again, I'm reminded of what happens when human beings tread in the realm of gods or vice versa. And that seems to be Bilquis's fate here. Without that worship, she is a goddess in the mortal realm. And that is where she loses her identity. That is where she loses that motive force. So I don't necessarily read Gaiman's, you know, stark depiction of Bilquis's condition here as being necessarily critical of sex work in general. I don't think that that is actually a point which we are free to extrapolate from the text. I would argue pretty strenuously to the contrary, actually. All right, good. Here we are. Let's push on then, because that's one slide and I'm 25 minutes in. This is just working out beautifully. We'll skip over the other two interludes, mostly because they're played for jokes. We get the phone call between Marguerite Olsen and Sam, beloved character Sam, who's going to show up again in this week's reading. That's fun, and it's a great character piece, but it doesn't really add anything to our understanding except creating a slight dramatic irony when we move into chapter 13. But we're going to resolve all of that in the span of today's reading anyway. I would have spent a little more time on that if we had covered the interludes at the end of the last session. And then, of course, interlude 3 is simply Laura and the zombie shift. It's a pretty good joke, but there's really no more than that here, because we knew what Laura was going to do more or less from the end of her conversation with Shadow in the last chapter. So with that, let's move into chapter 13 and begin with Saturday morning. It was Saturday morning. Shadow answered the door. Marguerite Olsen was there. She did not come in, just stood there in the sunlight, looking serious. Mr. Ainsel? Mike, please, said Shadow. Mike, yes. Would you like to come over for dinner tonight, about 6-ish? It won't be anything exciting, just spaghetti and meatballs. Not a problem. I like spaghetti and meatballs. Obviously, if you have any other plans. I have no other plans. 6 o'clock. Should I bring flowers? If you must, but this is a social gesture, not a romantic one. She closed the door behind her. He showered. He went for a short walk down to the bridge and back. The sun was up, a tarnished quarter in the sky, and he was sweating in his coat by the time he got home. It had to be above freezing. He drove the 4Runner down to Dave's Finest Foods and bought a bottle of wine. It was a $20 bottle, which seemed to Shadow like some kind of guarantee of quality. He didn't know wines, but he figured that for $20 it ought to taste good. He bought a Californian Cabernet because Shadow had once seen a bumper sticker back when he was younger and people still had bumper stickers on their cars which said, "Life is a Cabernet," and it had made him laugh. He bought a plant in a pot as a gift. Green leaves, no flowers. Nothing remotely romantic about that. He bought a carton of milk, which he would never drink, and a selection of fruit, which he would never eat. We'll talk about that last line as we get to it, but we're going to begin with this charming interaction between Marguerite and Shadow here, or at least Marguerite and Shadow on the surface, but not really, right? Marguerite and Mike, and we're going to talk about Mike Ainsel with great purpose as we move through this chapter, because this is the point at which Mike Ainsel falls apart, or perhaps it is more accurate to say this is the point at which a wrecking ball shaped like Audrey crashes through the walls of Mike's home. Maybe even 2 wrecking balls. The first shaped like Sam, the second shaped like Audrey. By the time we finish this reading, Mike Ainsel is no more. He has been lost to Shadow. And that is going to kind of foreshadow some of the grief, if I can make a horrible pun on Shadow's name, that is going to foreshadow some of the grief that Shadow is going to experience later in the chapter, if it's fair to call that grief. We'll talk about that when we get there. So no other plans, shadows just existing in Lakeside, still in this stasis, still playing the role of Mike Ainsel, not quite connected, not quite whole, certainly not active. But here we see again and always his continuing integration into Lakeside. He showered, went for a short walk down to the bridge and back. The sun was up, a tarnished quarter in the sky, by the way, echoing the idea of coins as sun and moon. He is still carrying the Liberty Dollar with him, given to him by Zariah Polachanaya. And he was sweating in his coat by the time he got home. It had to be above freezing. How different Shadow's experience is now compared to his arrival in Lakeside. Shadow is in decline and Mike Ainsel is in ascendance. And that is going to make what comes next even harder. Even here, as he's buying the wine, he's reminded, and we get so few memories from Shadow of the time before he went to prison that they all stand out. And what memories we do get, what accounts we do get, are generally of his childhood years. But this is not child Shadow. This is mature adult Shadow. This is just before he went to prison. He was a different person. He bought a Californian Cabernet because Shadow had once seen a bumper sticker back when he was younger, and people still had bumper stickers on their cars which said life is a Cabernet, and it had made him laugh. Who was that guy? Who was that Shadow? Can we imagine this Shadow laughing at a bumper sticker? Can we imagine Mike Ainsel laughing at a bumper sticker? Probably not. But Shadow used to be someone very different before prison. And that's important because his prison experiences are going to be a fulcrum around which his characterization will turn by the time that we get into the next chapter here. And can we just command Marguerite Olsen, who is, of course, great and adored by everyone? Can we just commend her for that last line? Should I bring flowers? Shadow asks, awkwardly, charmingly, scuffing the dirt with his Skechers sneakers. If you must, she says, but this is a social gesture, not a romantic one. Marguerite, how empowered are you? That's magnificent, and I adore it very much. And of course, this is calling back to the phone conversation too that she just had with Sam. So Shadow barely has time to oh, Aaron says here, I'm still convinced that her grammar chat with Shadow in his first Lakeside visit was a test of his intelligence. Yes, I like that very much. I completely agree. Yeah. And Elizabeth says, I effing love this Shadow. Love him. What a good guy. Isn't he just a good guy? Even if he is playing a part here, even if he is adopting the lakesideness of Mike Ainsel a little too fully, perhaps. But even as he awkwardly wonders what he should do, his peace, his calm, his reverie here in Lakeside, this mundane life where he's going to go over to the neighbor's house for dinner on a Saturday, this is interrupted by a call from Wednesday. Shadow's telephone rang. Yeah, he said. That's no way to answer the phone, growled Wednesday. When I get my telephone connected, I'll answer it politely, said Shadow. Can I help you? I don't know, said Wednesday. There was a pause. Then he said, organizing gods is like herding cats into straight lines. They don't take naturally to it. There was a deadness and an exhaustion in Wednesday's voice that Shadow had never heard before. What's wrong? It's hard. It's too fucking hard. I don't know if this is going to work. We might as well cut our throats, just cut our own throats. You mustn't talk like that. Yeah, right. Well, if you do cut your throat, said Shadow, trying to jolly Wednesday out of his darkness, maybe it wouldn't even hurt. It would hurt. Even for my kind, pain still hurts. If you move and act in the material world, then the material world acts on you. Pain hurts, just as greed intoxicates and lust burns. We may not die easy, and we sure as hell don't die well, but we can die. If we're still loved and remembered, something else a lot like us comes along and takes our place, and the whole damn thing starts all over again. And if we're forgotten, we're done. So finally, we get a glimpse of the life cycle of gods. This Wednesday can die. There will be something else someday soon, presumably. The myth of Odin will be re-embodied. The belief in Odin will be re-embodied in someone who probably looks a lot like Wednesday, acts a lot like Wednesday, maybe even remembers the things that Wednesday remembers. But this Wednesday will die. And of course, we've just had an account of the death of an old god. Will Bilquis be remembered? Will there be another Bilquis out there? Will there be another Queen of Sheba, mythic and glorious? Well, probably not. Probably not in America, anyway. Forgotten, this Bilquis may well die permanently. in the way that gods do, ungrieved and unremembered. But it is possible that somewhere out there, a new Bilquis is awakening, just coming together out of the ether. Does that work for mortals who have ascended to godhood? Possibly, possibly. Aaron says here, yes, Nicole says, every bit, including Shadow being kind to Bast as a kitty, was food for my cat lady soul. And Aaron says, going forward, I'm going to play it safe and just treat every cat like it might be Bast. I think that's probably wise. One of them probably is, right? Many of them probably are. Yeah, good. Jonathan Nash says, feels a lot like how they've been describing the Doctor's regenerations of late. That's a good pull right there. Yes, there is a partial continuity of experience, but not a complete continuity of experience. That's very, very good. Yes, that's interesting, particularly given, of course, Gaiman's connection to Doctor Who. Yeah, excellent. So here we get this perspective on the death of gods. And of course, this is immediate and stark foreshadowing. But what is perhaps more important here is the hopelessness that Wednesday demonstrates. This is not a Wednesday that we have seen before, not a Wednesday that we have heard before. It's hard. It's too fucking hard. I don't know if this is going to work. We might as well cut our throats. He's almost on the brink of giving up, which explains why he is so willing to move toward this truce. In this moment, Wednesday doesn't believe that it's going to work. Or Wednesday believes that it is going to work, but will require a greater sacrifice. We'll get to all of that in just a moment. So from there, he tells Shadow to stay in Lakeside, to keep his head down, and Shadow does as he ought to do, goes over to dinner with Marguerite, which, hey guys, did you know that Sam was going to be there? Sam is beautiful throughout this entire exchange. She is so poised, so smart. Marguerite is no slouch either. I really like her characterization. I've been thinking about this a lot, actually. What I want, I think, is just the story of Lakeside. What I want is like the alternate universe version of this, where maybe we just follow Chad Mulligan. Maybe he's the protagonist of this story, where he's just trying to deal with weird stuff happening in Lakeside. I am super into that, by the way. So that's a story that I want. But here we see the threads coming together. And I talked about that turning point earlier, and the way in which the diamond shape of the plot is now, we've passed that midpoint where it is at its widest, and now we're starting to collapse back down toward our climax. And this is where plots will crash into each other. This is where connections will be made. This is where things get a little tighter and a little more focused as we move forward. And this is a prime example of that. Here's Sam. What are the odds? What are the chances that this is going to be Sam? Well, this is not the most startling or striking coincidence that we'll get in this chapter, but it is significant, particularly when we look at it alongside Audrey. After dinner, Sam persuades Shadow to take her down to the buck stops here, so they slip out for an hour, and this is the exchange that we get. He drove the car out onto the street, got out and closed the garage door, got back into the car. Sam was looking at him oddly as he got in, as if the confidence had begun to leak out of her. He put on his seatbelt and she said, I'm scared. This was a stupid thing to do, wasn't it? Getting into a car with a psycho killer? I got you safe home last time, said Shadow. You killed 2 men, she said. You're wanted by the feds, and now I find out you're living under an assumed name next door to my sister, unless Mike Ainsel is your real name? No, said Shadow, and he sighed. It's not. He hated saying it. It was as if he were letting go of something important, abandoning Mike Ainsel by denying him, as if he were taking his leave of a friend. Did you kill those men? No. They came to my house and said we'd been seen together, and this guy showed me photographs of you. What was his name? Mr. Hat? No, Mr. Town. That was him. It was like The Fugitive, but I said I hadn't seen you. Thank you. So, she said, tell me what's going on. I'll keep your secrets if you keep mine. I don't know any of yours, said Shadow. I'm struggling to find the words to articulate how much this hits me, how this deflation of hope in Shadow mirrors the deflation of hope that we have seen previously in Wednesday, how hard this is for Shadow, who we have discussed now for what? 4 chapters, 5 chapters, has been growing into the character of Mike Ainsel, has been becoming Mike Ainsel, has been finding a comfort and a place and a security and an identity within Mike Ainsel and within Lakeside in general. Here, he's giving it up. And he is about to give it up permanently, but that transition starts here. He has been living a fantasy. He has been living something that is unreal. There is no way that Mike Ainsel is sustainable. He is an escape. He is a story that Shadow liked to tell. And now he's done. even before we get to the buck stops here, even before we see Audrey, even before things fall apart the way that things fall apart, he has to give it up. And we see here how much he hates it. No, said Shadow, and he sighed. It's not. He hated saying it. It was as if he were letting go of something important, abandoning Mike Ainsel by denying him, as if he were taking his leave of a friend. He's done. He's Shadow again from here on out. So many amazing spinoffs. Yes, Elizabeth says, you guys are killing me with all the amazing spinoffs. I want them all. Yeah. And Nicole asks, anyone else have a moment of fear for Sam when she shows up in Lakeside? What with the disappearances? Yeah, I'm not going to talk too much about the exploration that we get of that right now because it's going to become relevant later in the book, but there it is. And I'm just now realizing that we didn't talk about that last line in the previous slide. So I'm actually going to move back to the previous slide. Where is it? Here it is. 2 slides back. My goodness, I do apologize because I really wanted to highlight this line. He bought a carton of milk, which he would never drink, and a selection of fruit, which he would never eat. A couple of different ways of looking at this. Is this foreshadowing? Is this simple, stark foreshadowing? Something is going to happen to Shadow. It's going to happen soon. We don't know what it is, but he is right now investing in a future that he himself will never realize. Possibly. It certainly works on that level. He bought a carton of milk, which he would never drink, and a selection of fruit, which he would never eat. Who is doing that? Is that Mike that is doing that? Is this an investment specifically not just in Shadow's future, a future that he will not realize, but rather in the future of Mike Ainsel, a future which will very soon shatter and fall apart? Or is something else happening here? Does Shadow know, as he is buying the milk that he will never drink and the fruit that he will never eat? Is he aware that this is true? Is he just maybe not a milk drinker? Is he maybe just not a fruit eater? Is he buying these things because they are conventional? Because this is what is expected of Mike Ainsel? I love very much Gaiman's efficiency here. With one ambiguous line, he tells us something about Shadow, something about Mike, and something about Mike's life in Lakeside. And all of those things can be true simultaneously. They can all work simultaneously. It's very powerful. All right. We need to keep pushing on, though, and we get to what is probably my favorite monologue in the entire book. I debated long and hard whether or not to pull this slide, and in the end, of course, I had no choice. I simply had to pull it because this is Sam's I Believe monologue. I can believe things that are true, and I can believe things that aren't true, and I can believe things where nobody knows if they're true or not. I can believe in Santa Claus and the Easter Bunny and Marilyn Monroe and the Beatles and Elvis and Mr. Ed. Listen, I believe that people are perfectible, that knowledge is infinite, that the world is run by secret banking cartels and is visited by aliens on a regular basis, nice ones that look like wrinkly lemurs and bad ones who mutilate cattle and want our water and our women. I believe that the future sucks, and I believe that the future rocks, and I believe that one day White Buffalo Woman is going to come back and kick everyone's ass. I believe that all men are just overgrown boys with deep problems communicating, and that the decline in good sex in America is coincident with the decline in drive-in movie theaters from state to state. I believe that all politicians are unprincipled crooks, and I still believe that they're better than the alternative. Sink into the sea when the big one comes, while Florida is going to dissolve into madness and alligators and toxic waste. I believe that antibacterial soap is destroying our resistance to dirt and disease so that one day we'll all be wiped out by the common cold like the Martians in War of the Worlds. I believe that the greatest poets of the last century were Edith Sitwell and Don Marquis, that jade is dried dragon sperm, that thousands of years ago in a former life I was a one-armed Siberian shaman. I believe that mankind's destiny lies in the stars. I believe that candy really did taste better when I was a kid, that it's aerodynamically impossible for a bumblebee to fly, that light is a wave and a particle, that there's a cat in a box somewhere who's alive and dead at the same time, although if they don't ever open that box to feed it, eventually it'll just be 2 different kinds of dead, and that there are stars in the universe billions of years older than the universe itself. I believe in a personal God who cares about me and worries and oversees everything I do. Oh God, who set the universe in motion and went off to hang with her girlfriends and doesn't even know that I'm alive. I believe in an empty and godless universe of causal chaos, background noise, and sheer blind luck. I believe that anyone who says that sex is overrated just hasn't done it properly. I believe that anyone who claims to know what's going on will lie about the little things too. I believe in absolute honesty and sensible social lies. I believe in a woman's right to choose, a baby's right to live, and while all human life is sacred, there's nothing wrong with the death penalty if you can trust the legal system implicitly, but that no one but a moron would ever trust the legal system. I believe that life is a game, life is a cruel joke, and that life is what happens when you're alive, and that you might as well lie back and enjoy it. She stopped, out of breath. This is possibly the greatest monologue in this entire book. Okay, Let me go further. This is the greatest monologue in this entire book, you guys. This is possibly one of the all-time great monologues. This is fantastic. Sam is a marvel of a creation. I could spend, no kidding, an hour and a half talking about this slide, because the deep roots of every single one of these ideas, the roots that find themselves entrapped and enmeshed and entangled with the deepest and most fundamental notions of American culture, of millennial culture, of life. These ideas are huge, every single one of them. And Sam's perspective, as complex and as beautiful as it is still singular. It is still world like a fingerprint. It is, I cannot say enough good things about this. A couple of things that we should probably, pull out here. Yes, of course, White Buffalo Woman. Reference to an old god, a Native American god, should not go overlooked in this particular context. This is important. Also, I believe that I was a one-armed Siberian shaman in a thousands of years ago in a former life. I was a one-armed Siberian shaman. Hey, Sam, that's a hell of a coincidence, because right at the end of this chapter, we're going to meet thousands of years ago a one-armed Siberian shaman. Huh. Wonder if you're onto something there. Jade, probably not dried dragon sperm, but I guess no one knows for sure. We get our brief move through science here. I believe that candy really did taste better when I was a kid, which is just beautifully done. It's aerodynamically impossible for a bumblebee to fly. False. Light is a wave and a particle. Kind of true. And there's a cat in a box somewhere who's alive and dead at the same time. Nice reference to Schrodinger's cat. What we forget about Schrodinger's cat, of course, is that Schrodinger postulated the cat thesis, the cat hypothesis, as a disproof of quantum mechanics. The whole point of the Schrodinger's cat box experiment is that, of course, it isn't possible for the cat to be simultaneously alive and dead. Schrodinger was making a joke. He was making a point. But nonetheless, Sam has not the true appreciation for Schrodinger's cat, but rather the pop culture appreciation for Schrodinger's cat, which is much more important because it is part of the story that she tells about herself, part of the story that she tells about her culture. This entire paragraph is America. It is America from the perspective of Sam. And honestly, a little bit, I want to live in her America. Let me see here. Yes, Jonathan saying, really hopeful about seeing this done well on the screen, but really wary about it though. Oh boy, I hadn't thought of that, Jonathan. It hadn't occurred to me that we're going to get this in the TV show. You guys, I really hope it's good, or I might be done with the TV show at that point. If, season 2 of Storms on the Way comes to a sudden and abrupt end, you'll know that this is why. Yeah. Or worse, cut her out entirely, says Nicole. Yes. It's tempting. I can't imagine that they would, because she's such a good character, and there's a dearth of strong female characters on television right now. It would be really great to do it. Yeah. All right. And Nicole also says, I bet Bast could solve the problem of Schrodinger's cat. That's lovely. Yes. Okay. All of this is to say, I didn't just pull this slide because it is magnificent, because it is a work of beauty, though it certainly is. I pulled it because it is representative of the story that Sam tells. It is complex. All the way back in the first episode of Storms on the Way, I talked about Gaiman's purpose, his stated and explicit purpose with American Gods. It was part of this mythopoeic effort to create for the United States an aggregate mythology, a mythology that isn't dependent on individual fragmentary stories, but unifies those stories into something that speaks to the nature of the land itself. I'm inadvertently using very powerful language, and I didn't mean to. Not the land, but the country, the nation of the United States. This is the result of exactly that kind of mythopoeic act. Here, a myth has been created, an aggregate mythology has been created, and Sam is recounting it. Sam is experiencing it, recounting a tiny fragment of it, I'm sure, but nonetheless trying to express something that is true to her, trying to express something that is true to her experience. She believes, because human beings believe. And it has been said that it is a mark of madness to believe in two contradictory things at once. And if that is true, then all human beings are mad, because we find it easy to believe. We find it easy to believe in two contradictory things at once. Hey, two contradictory things? I can do that standing on my head on any given Thursday. 15 contradictory things. I can believe in all of them, and I'm doing it right now. And so are you. This is Sam's vision of America. This is Sam's vision of the American myth. And it is vital that we understand what that looks like. It is very easy to be pulled into the perspective of the gods here, particularly the old gods. It is very easy to see humans as being faithless and feckless, that humans have somehow fallen from the path of true faith and worship and have become secularized. And that's simply untrue. Human beings are human beings, and we continue to believe. We don't believe in the old gods anymore, but we still believe. And in a way, in a crucial way, Sam worships the only American god that there is, America. In that sense, Sam is perhaps more representative of, particularly, I think, that Midwest experience. And we've talked before about how odd it is that in a novel entitled American Gods, what Gaiman is actually talking about are like 6 states kind of stacked up together in the middle of the country. He's not really talking about the West Coast for all that we've been there. He's not really talking about the East Coast. He's really just talking about the Midwest, because that is the heart of America. That is the true America. And Sam here is demonstrating that she is a true American by believing in the contradiction and the snarl of American myth itself. Okay. Nicole is asking, this is very good. Yeah, Aaron's saying here they need a powerful actress for Sam. Natalie Morales or Aubrey Plaza could do it, but I think they're both better in slightly older roles now. Yeah, I'd want someone really young. I'd want someone who really spoke to you know, that teenage perspective. I think that would be really appropriate. And Nicole's asking, does anyone have any good headcanon casting for Sam? And Aaron says Zendaya. Oh, that's awfully good. If you have just seen Spider-Man Homecoming, Michelle, who goes by another name right at the end of the movie, that's Michelle. And she would, good Lord, that's very good, actually. That's very good. Yeah, okay, I'm going to be thinking about that. That's excellent. Okay, let's keep pushing on. I can't believe I spent that long on the I Believe monologue, and yet I can't believe that I just did the I Believe monologue in the middle of an entire session. I could have spent an hour and a half talking about that just itself. From there, we get to the buck stops here, and things go horribly. There is suddenly screaming. And it turns out that the recently widowed cousin in whom Chad Mulligan is interested is Audrey. Audrey Burton looked at him incredulously. Are you crazy? He worked for Robbie for years. His slutty wife was my best friend. He's wanted for murder. I had to answer questions. He's an escaped convict. She was way over the top, her voice trembling with suppressed hysteria, sobbing out her words like a soap actress going for a daytime Emmy. Kissing cousins, thought Shadow, unimpressed. Nobody in the bar said a word. Chad Mulligan looked up at Shadow. It's probably a mistake. I'm sure we can sort this all out, he said sensibly. Then he said to the bar, it's all fine. Nothing to worry about. We can sort this out. Everything's fine. Then to Shadow, step outside, Mike. Quiet competence. Shadow was impressed. Sure, said Shadow. He felt a hand touch his hand, and he turned to see Sam staring at him. He smiled down at her as reassuringly as he could. Sam looked at Shadow, and then she looked around the bar at the faces staring at them. She said to Audrey Burton, I don't know who you are, but you are such a cunt. Then she went up on tiptoes and pulled Shadow down to her and kissed him hard on the lips, pushing her mouth against his for what felt to Shadow like several minutes, and might have been as long as 5 seconds in real clock-ticking time. It was a strange kiss, Shadow thought, as her lips pressed against his. It wasn't intended for him. It was for the other people in the bar, to let them know that she had picked sides. It was a flag-waving kiss. Even as she kissed him, he became certain that she didn't even like him. Well, not like that. Still, there was a tale he had read once long ago as a small boy. The story of a traveler who had slipped down a cliff with man-eating tigers above him and a lethal fall below him, who managed to stop his fall halfway down the side of the cliff, holding on for dear life. There was a clump of strawberries beside him and certain death above him and below. What should he do? Went the question. And the reply was, eat the strawberries. The story had never made any sense to him as a boy. It did now. So he closed his eyes, threw himself into the kiss, and experienced nothing but Sam's lips and the softness of her skin against his, sweet as a wild strawberry. The idea of this performative kiss from Sam is absolutely perfect, I think. That Sam would so quickly take sides, not just in favor of Shadow, but against Audrey. Crucially, here she is compelled by both arguments. She does, it would seem, have some kind of trust in Shadow, some kind of faith in Shadow. But also, simultaneously, she super hates Audrey. And super hates, we know for sure, everything that Audrey represents. That kind of hysteria, that kind of soap opera actress account that we get at the beginning here, that is not for Sam. So she kisses Shadow to demonstrate to the people in the bar whose side she is on, and also to demonstrate for herself whose side she is on, but not, I think, to demonstrate to Shadow. And there is something here that I like very much. I enjoy very much the complexity of Shadow's response, that he is able to enjoy the kiss for what it is, for the strawberry that it is, without necessarily clinging to Sam. This is not about anything other than a sensual moment. It's not about a connection between he and her. He knows for sure that or suspects at least, that she doesn't even like him. Not in that way. He knows that this is not the beginning of something else. This is not that moment when the chips are down and the climax is about to hit and the heroine kisses the hero and suddenly this is a romantic relationship. No, this is not that. It's just a kiss. And with death above and death below, he's taking the time to eat the strawberry that's presented to him. That I like very much. I know that some readers find this scene a little problematic, but for me, it reads as absolutely true to each character and doesn't cross the line into anything uncomfortable, honestly. I don't necessarily see anything here that makes me critical of Shadow or suspicious of Sam's motivations here. It works pretty well. Jonathan Nash says in the YouTube chat, I love this moment. And Skiba pulls out, I always think of the time in Empire when Leia kisses Luke in the infirmary, a flag-waving kiss. That's a very good pull. That's a very good pull, Skiba. Yes. We also see here exactly what Mike was talking about in the last reading, about being a cop in a small town. Mostly, it's about persuading people to keep their cool. Mostly, it's about managing uproar and preventing things from getting worse. And we see here, as Shadow says, quiet competence. It's probably a mistake. I'm sure we can sort this all out. Then he said to the bar, it's all fine. Nothing to worry about. We can sort this out. Everything's fine. He's diffusing the situation. And I think we get here, better than at any other point in the narrative, a strong sense of why Chad Mulligan is so good at his job. He really is a great small-town sheriff. It's very appropriate that he be taking this role. Okay, let's keep moving on because we're not even at the end here. Shadow is taken back to the police station where he is simultaneously shown great courtesy and civility by Chad and by Officer Lisa. Her name has just escaped my mind. I have it written down here. Let me find it because I definitely want to honor her. She's great. Where is this? If you can call out in the YouTube chat. Is her name Officer Lisa? Officer Butte is her surname, right? I forget her first name. That's terrible. I guess I didn't have it written down. I apologize. But she's great anyway. And they're showing Shadow great civility and great courtesy and a certain amount of respect. And this is contrasted, of course, with Shadow's first prolonged exposure to a television since he first met media. And in the of a Cheers episode, she taunts him still further and then shows him Liz. It is Liz. Thank you, Nicole. You're absolutely right. Liz Butte. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Let's take a look at what finally happens here when Shadow is being shown the closed-circuit television. Shadow recognized the voice of the man with his back to the camera. It was Mr. World, the one who had spoken to town on the cell phone while Shadow was in town's head. You don't believe, said Mr. World, that we will keep our word. I think your promises were made to be broken and your oaths to be forsworn, but I will keep my word. Safe conduct is safe conduct, said Mr. World, and a flag of truce is what we agreed. I should tell you, by the way, that your young protege is once more in our custody. Wednesday snorted. No, he said, he's not. We were discussing the ways to deal with the coming paradigm shift. We don't have to be enemies, do we? Wednesday still seemed shaken. He said, I will do whatever is in my power. Shadow noticed something strange about the image of Wednesday on the television screen. A red glint burned on his left eye, the glass one. The eye burned with a scarlet light. The glint left a phosphor dot after image as he moved. Wednesday seemed unaware of it. It's a big country, said Wednesday, marshalling his thoughts. He moved his head and the scarlet glitter blur slipped to his cheek, a red laser pointer dot, then it edged up to his glass eye once more. There is room for... There was a bang, muted by the television speakers, and the side of Wednesday's head exploded. His body tumbled backward. Our first time through American Gods, this can feel perilously close to a betrayal. This can feel unearned. It can feel sudden. It can feel forced. But when we read again, and when we read carefully, as we have been over the course of the last 20 sessions here, I guess, we can see so much foreshadowing pointing to this moment. There's so much leading up to the sudden, stark death of Wednesday. The power of it, particularly Shadow witnessing this death, but removed, intermediated, of course, by media, which is what media does. Media removes us from our immediate and personal and intimate connection with events, but presents the representation of the event as though it were the same thing. Here, Shadow is separated and the emotional impact delayed. We'll talk about that emotional impact as we move into chapter 14, certainly. Here, even as World is negotiating, he betrays Wednesday. And Wednesday is, for those of you who have not yet read ahead, actually dead. Just actually dead. We'll deal with that as we go ahead. Shadow is surrendered from the custody of the Lakeside Sheriff's Department into the custody of a couple of officers who come to get him, who turn out to be somewhat familiar. The doors to the outside world opened. The snow was still falling, dizzying into the car's headlights. The driver put his foot on the gas and they were heading back down the street and onto Main Street. "You heard about Wednesday," said the driver. His voice sounded different now, older and familiar. "He's dead." "Yeah, I know," said Shadow. "I saw it on TV. Excuse me, those fuckers," said the white officer. It was the first thing he had said, and his voice was rough and accented, and like the driver's, it was a voice that Shadow knew. "I tell you, they are fuckers, those fuckers." "Thanks for coming to get me," said Shadow. "Don't mention it," said the driver. In the light of an oncoming car, his face already looked older. He looked smaller, too. The last time Shadow had seen him, he had been wearing lemon yellow gloves and a check jacket. "We were in Milwaukee. Still had to drive like demons when I was called." "You think we let them lock you up and send you to the chair while I'm still waiting to break your head with my hammer?" said the white deputy gloomily, fumbling in his pocket for a pack of cigarettes. His accent was East European. "The real ship will hit the fan in an hour or less," said Mr. Nancy, looking more like himself with each moment. "And when they really turn up to collect you, we'll pull over before we get to Highway 53 and get you out of those shackles and back into your own clothes." Chernobog held up a handcuff key and smiled. "I like the mustache," said Shadow. "Suits you." Chernobog stroked it with a yellowed finger. "Thank you." "Wednesday," said Shadow. "Is he really dead? This isn't some kind of trick, is it?" He realized that he'd been holding on to some kind of hope, foolish though it was, but the expression on Nancy's face told him all he needed to know, and the hope was gone. The death of hope for Shadow as he comes to terms with the death of Wednesday. It's comedic, it's thoughtful, it's bright and oddly brittle, and yet for me, the rescue by Nancy and Chernobog is perfect. Here we are seeing Shadow ascend into another tier of his own existence, and something here has happened. And it might take us a little while to figure out exactly what, but something here has happened. In the absence of Wednesday, Shadow has stepped up, and we're going to see in a metaphorical sense why that is true in the pages to come in the rest of today's reading. But here it is immediate. Here we can see this ascension from Shadow. And partly this is because he is numbed, partly because he has not yet emotionally processed what has happened to Wednesday. So even here at the end of this slide, Wednesday, is he really dead? This isn't some kind of trick. We're told explicitly that Shadow is holding on to hope, but that is a numbed hope. He is commenting first on Chernobog's mustache before he does it. He isn't surprised to have been rescued by Nancy and Chernobog. This is a very different kind of experience for Shadow as he moves into a very different kind of realm. Becca Eller says in the YouTube chat, "These two driving by themselves must have been the weirdest road trip ever." Here's my question to you. Nancy and Chernobog are taking a road trip. What music do they listen to? What is the Pandora station that will satisfy these two? I'm not sure that I can make that work. I'm not sure even my vaunted and legendary playlist skills could somehow satisfy both Chernobog and Mr. Nancy. We're going to take a brief beat here at the end of chapter 13 to talk about the one-armed Siberian shaman from long ago. This is our Coming to America, and we're going to ghost over a lot of this, even though I really love this section, but we still have a lot of ground to cover. This is from the Coming to America. "You shall lead us safely," said Utsula. "I shall die at the foot of the cliff, and that shall be the sacrifice that takes you into the new lands." To the west of them, back in the lands from which they had come, where the sun had set hours before, there was a flash of sickly yellow light, brighter than lightning, brighter than daylight, a burst of pure brilliance that forced the folk on the land bridge to cover their eyes and spit and exclaim. Children began to wail. That is the doom that Nanyuneni warned us of, said Kugwe the Old. Surely he is a wise god and a mighty one. He is the best of all gods, said Kalanu. In our new land we shall raise him up on high, and we shall polish his tusks and skull with fish oil and animal fat, and we shall tell our children, and our children's children, and our seventh children's children, that Nanyuneni is the mightiest of all gods, and shall never be forgotten. Gods are great, said Atsula slowly, as if she were comprehending a great secret. But the heart is greater, for it is from our hearts they come, and to our hearts they shall return. And there is no telling how long she might have continued in this blasphemy, had it not been interrupted in a manner that brooked no argument. The roar that erupted from the west was so loud that ears bled, and they could hear nothing for some time, temporarily blinded and deafened, but alive, knowing that they were luckier than the tribes to the west of them. It is good, said Atsula, but she could not hear the words inside her head. Atsula died at the foot of the cliffs when the spring sun was at its zenith. She did not live to see the new world, and the tribe walked into those lands with no holy women. Gods are great, but the heart is greater, for it is from our hearts they come, and to our hearts they shall return. Throughout this reading, really from the beginning of the interludes, all the way through to the end of chapter 14, we are having our understanding of gods and godhood challenged outright. We have the decline and the descent of Bilquis. We have the outright murder of Wednesday. We're going to have some different accounts of power and stability. We know that pain is pain. We know that pain hurts. We are about to learn that Thor took his own life rather than live in this diminished state, and that presumably out there, particularly after the advent of the Marvel movies, which Neil Gaiman could not have foreseen back in the year 2000, but somewhere out there, presumably a new Thor is coming into being, or is already walking this land. But individual gods die. And when individual gods die and pass into forgotten, then they are dead forever. And in the absence of holy women, as Atsula's tribe moves into the new world, in the absence of holy women, no one is there to tell the story of Nanyuneni. No one is there to preserve this mightiest of gods. So Nanyuneni is ultimately forgotten. Yeah. All right. Let me excellent. You're all answering parts the playlist question. Let me see here. Nancy just sings about tigers, says Becca Eller. Death metal, of course, says Madge, then apologizes for it. Madge, no apology necessary. You were right on the money there. Skipa says, Chernobog hums old Russian folk tunes, all in minor keys. I would like that very much indeed. Yes, good. All right. So that is our Coming to America, and it does, as I say, offer a new perspective on the relationship between human beings and gods, or rather expands upon an existing inference. We already understood that this was the case and have speculated about this to some degree previously, but here we get the moment of realization. We get to the moment of a moment in which the limitations of gods, even the greatest of gods, are suddenly understood, are suddenly stark ahead of us. All right, let's push into chapter 14 then and try and wrap this thing up in timely fashion. We begin chapter 14 with the switching out of vehicles. We are moving into the magic bus, into the VW bus with the rainbow on the back, which we get from Elvis, previously met at the House on the Rock. Chernobog seemed to be ready to argue it further, but Mr. Nancy intervened smoothly. Elvis, you came through for us. We're very grateful. Now that car needs to get back to Chicago. We'll leave it in Bloomington, said the bearded man. The wolves will take care of it. Don't give it another thought. He turned back to Shadow. Again, you have my sympathy and I share your pain. Good luck. And if the vigil falls to you, my admiration and my sympathy. He squeezed Shadow's hand in sympathy and in friendship with his own catcher's mitt fist. It hurt. You tell his corpse when you see it. Tell him that Alvis, son of Vindolf, will keep the faith. The VW bus smelled of patchouli, of old incense and rolling tobacco. There was a faded pink carpet glued to the floor and to the walls. Who was that? Asked Shadow as he drove them down the ramp, grinding the gears. Just like he said, Alvis, son of Vindolf, he's the king of the dwarves, the biggest, mightiest, greatest of all the dwarf folk. But he's not a dwarf, pointed out Shadow. He's what, 5'8", 5'9"? Which makes him giant among dwarves, said Chernobog from behind him. Tallest dwarf in America. What was that about the vigil? Asked Shadow. The two old men said nothing. Shadow glanced to his right. Mr. Nancy was staring out of the window. Well, he was talking about a vigil. You heard him. Chernobog spoke up from the back seat. You will not have to do it, he said. Do what? The vigil. He talks too much. All the dwarves talk and talk and talk and sing all the time. Sing, sing, sing. There's nothing to think of. Better you put it out of your mind. All the dwarves sing, sing, sing. Far over misty mountains cold. We're moving again here, continuing our movement here through the realm of the gods. Shadow is now on the inside track. Shadow is one of them, and we have the looming specter of the vigil ahead of us. This was part of the original compact made between Wednesday and Shadow is thinking of the vigil now as he progresses forward, and we'll come to his final resolution with regard to the vigil in just a few slides' time. But as he's moving through, he is thinking of the compact. He is thinking of the obligation. He is thinking, or at least alluding to, the myth. But he isn't yet thinking about it in personal terms. And it is vital that we understand that when Shadow undertakes the vigil, it is for personal reasons. It isn't actually related to the compact, or at least not exclusively related to the compact. So we have our magical VW bus because this is the last vehicle that they will look for, that the new gods will look for in the Americas. This is something very, very different. And it works really quite beautifully. Yes, and Nicole is anticipating me here perfectly. Figures that the bus that's meant to transport Odin's dead body is painted as a rainbow because here we have the Bifrost, the bridge to Asgard. This is a nice little reference. I think that is genuinely intentional. Yes, good, good. All right. So from here onward to one of the most fascinating settings, one of the most fascinating locales that we'll get in the entire book. Determining the exact center of anything can be problematic at best. With living things, people, for example, or continents, the problem becomes one of intangibles. What is the center of a man? What is the center of a dream? And in the case of the continental United States, should one count Alaska when one attempts to find the center, or Hawaii? As the 20th century began, they made a huge model of the USA, the lower 48 states, out of cardboard, and to find the center, they balanced it on a pin until they found the single place it balanced. Near as anyone could figure out, the exact center of the continental United States was several miles south from Lebanon in Smith County, Kansas, on Johnny Gribb's hog farm. By the 1930s, the people of Lebanon were all ready to put a monument up in the middle of the hog farm, but Johnny Gribb said he didn't want millions of tourists coming in and tramping all over and upsetting the hogs, and the locals figured he had a point. So they put the monument to the geographical center of the United States 2 miles north of the town. They built a park, the stone monument to put in the park, and put a brass plaque to go on the monument to tell you that you were indeed looking at the exact geographic center of the United States of America. They blacktopped the road from the town to that little park, and certain of the influx of tourists just waiting to come to Lebanon, they even built a motel by the monument. They brought in a little mobile chapel as well, and took off the wheels. Then they waited for the tourists and the holidaymakers to come. All the people who wanted to tell the world they'd been at the center of America and marveled and prayed. The tourists did not come. Nobody came. It's a sad little park now with a mobile chapel in it a little bigger than an ice fishing hut that wouldn't fit in a small funeral party and a motel whose windows look like dead eyes. Which is why, concluded Mr. Nancy as they drove into Humansville, Missouri, population 1,084, the exact center of America is a tiny rundown park, an empty church, a pile of stones, and a derelict motel. So before we get to our analysis here, this is true. This is absolutely true. Johnny Gribb's hog farm, the monument 2 miles north, the whole thing. Yes, and as Jonathan's saying here in the YouTube chat, that Lebanon mention just made me jump to Supernatural again in the back of my head. Yeah, there's only so much you can do when we're hanging out in Kansas. Sometimes you're just going to think of the Winchester boys. You really are. Yes, absolutely. So here, this account is entirely true. Everything that is happening here is entirely true. But I want to focus first on this first paragraph. Determining the exact center of anything can be problematic at best. In whose voice is this passage written? Where are we now? Who is talking to us right now? Because we are disconnected from everything. Well, as we learn from the end of the excerpt, we're kind of in Mr. Nancy's voice. We effortlessly segue from the account into the attributed dialogue there, which is why, concluded Mr. Nancy as they drove into Humansville, Missouri, the exact center of America is a tiny rundown park. So presumably, as we start this, we are in Mr. Nancy's voice. But what does that tell us? Is there anything that we can gain here from that knowledge? Determining the exact center of anything can be problematic at best. With living things, people, for example, or continents, which is a nice little contrast there. Living things like continents. The problem becomes one of intangibles. What is the center of a man? Okay, we're dealing with living things. We're dealing with people. What is the center of a man? That is a legitimate question. Next question. What is the center of a dream? Well, whoa, hang on. What are we talking about now? Because we were talking about physical things, living things, people and continents. But now we're talking about dreams. And in the case of the continental United States, should one count Alaska when one attempts to find the center, or Hawaii? What does that have to do with either of the previous questions? I think the point here is subtle and perhaps deceptive, and perhaps to those of you who live in Alaska and in Hawaii, not all that positive and not all that great. But let's be clear about one very important thing. When we talk in the pages of American Gods about America, I've said many times that what we're really talking about is the United States of America. We're not talking about Canada. We're not talking about Mexico. And crucially, we are not talking about Alaska. And we are not talking about Hawaii. We are talking about the lower 48. Because when we tell the story of America, it seems to me that throughout the vast, overwhelming majority of popular culture, that's the story that we're telling. That is America. And those two other states, beautiful and fine, though I'm sure they are. I've never been to either, but I hope that someday I will go to both, possibly in the same trip. I have no idea. That would be an adventure. When we tell the story of America, we don't include those places. We don't include other US-held territories. We're not including Puerto Rico and Guam. We're not including things that aren't the lower 48. The lower 48, these states are America in a key and significant fashion. And as I said earlier, we can distill that still further. We don't necessarily have to be talking about the entire lower 48. What we're really talking about most of the time that we're talking about quote unquote America is the Midwest. We're talking about that band of states from the Rocky Mountains to the Great Lakes all the way south. And I guess, you know, we can roll in Kentucky to that too. That's what we're talking about. Our sense of, yeah, oh, this is interesting. Nicole here is calling out, I assumed Ibis. I assumed Ibis here. Yes, it feels like Ibis. Doesn't it feel more like Ibis? We don't get the brilliant Orlando Jones performance here in the book that we get from Mr. Nancy in the TV show. Determining the exact center of anything can be problematic at best. That doesn't sound like Nancy to me. That sounds like Ibis. That sounds like the prim and pedantic tone of Mr. Ibis. What we get from Nancy is generally very different, which is why, concluded Mr. Nancy, the exact center of America is a tiny rundown park, an empty church, a pile of stones, and a derelict motel. There it is. So are we getting Nancy's account, or are we getting an Ibis or an Ibis-like account that segues into, almost cinematically segues into, Mr. Nancy telling the same story? I think that we are. I don't feel necessarily as though this reads to me like Nancy. Yeah. Yeah, good. They have cruises that go from Alaska to Hawaii, says Becca. Well, there we go. Check it out. Yes, Aaron says in the YouTube chat, Mr. Nancy would never say problematic unless he was making fun of Mr. Ibis. I feel that is absolutely true, Aaron. That is one of the words that definitely stands out. Yes. As the 20th century began, they made a huge model of the USA, the lower 48 states, out of cardboard, and to find the center, they balanced it on a pin until they found the single place it balanced. None of this feels to me like Nancy. Instead, we're getting the intrusion of another narrative voice, which I think is important, I think is significant, and here's why. Following the death of Wednesday, Shadow has been literally pulled from the mundane realm, from the care of Chad Mulligan and Officer Liz. He has been pulled into the realm of gods once more by Nancy and by Chernobog. Now he has dealt with Elvis, excuse me, Elvis. Well, actually, that's a key point too. Now he understands that his name is Elvis. He's been mishearing this name as Elvis throughout the entire book. This happened at the House on the Rock, and it happens even at the beginning of that scene. But now he knows his true name. Now he knows his true nature. Shadow is moving inexorably into the realm of the gods. He's getting closer and closer and closer, and seems to be conscious of that as it's happening, seems to almost embrace it as it is happening. Shadow has never been further from Lakeside than he is going to be in just a few pages' time. Can this be some sort of American Gods themed vacation package? Asks Becca Eller. I'm afraid that the American Gods vacation package is just the road trip of the Midwest, isn't it? It's the House on the Rock in the middle of Kansas, and it's, you know, we'd go to the World Tree in Kentucky. That's probably there, right? Yggdrasil just hangs out in Kentucky. Where else would we go? That's probably it. We'd find some town that's analogous to Lakeside. Actually, there is the town that is analogous to Lakeside. I forget the name of it, but Lakeside is based on a real town. Yeah, so we can definitely do this. I'm super into this idea, Becca. You have to make your way to Oklahoma City first so that we can all start together, but it'll be fun. Yeah, we'll take Route 66 up towards Chicago. It'll be fantastic. Good. Nicole says, if you want to drink beer, eat Southern food from Tupperware, listen to Ibis's story, and pet Bast curled up in my lap, that's my ideal liminal state. That's beautiful. Oh, and Skeepa says, and don't forget Cairo. Yes, of course. We have to roll in Cairo too. Yes. Yes. Good. Good. All right. Let's keep going because Shadow has a very important question. This is what we've been leading up to, okay? So Shadow has been pulled into the realm of God, step by step by step. He's now integrated more. He's being treated for the first time as a peer by Nancy and by Chernobog, two of the oldest old gods. He's being treated as part of the team. And that leads us, of course, to an inevitable question. Who am I? Asked Shadow. You're a diversion, said the man. You were an opportunity. You gave the whole affair an air of credibility I would have been hard put to deliver solo, although both of us are committed enough to the affair to die for it, eh? Who are you? Asked Shadow. The hardest part is simply surviving, said the man. The bonfire, and Shadow realized with strange horror that it truly was a bonfire. Rib cages and fire-eyed skulls stared and stuck and jutted from the flames, sputtering trace element colors into the night. Greens and yellows and blues was flaring and crackling and burning hotly. 3 days on the tree, 3 days in the underworld, 3 days to find my way back. The flames sputtered and flared too brightly for Shadow to look at directly. He looked down into the darkness beneath the trees. There was no fire, no snow. There were no trees, no hanged bodies, no bloody spear. This is Shadow's dream. And as his dreams go, it is less metaphorical, less representative, and certainly much more literal. But note his focus as he moves through this dream, as he moves through the bonfire, as he is talking to, someone who is clearly representative of Wednesday, someone who isn't necessarily Wednesday in his entirety, but, there's a clear continuation there. His question, first, who am I? And then, who are you? You're a diversion, said the man. You were an opportunity. You gave the whole affair an air of credibility I would have been hard put to deliver solo, although both of us are committed enough to the affair to die for it, eh? Who is Shadow Moon? More on that as we move forward. Aaron says, I thought Yggdrasil was in West Virginia. It is in West Virginia. What did I say? I maybe said something else. I apologize. Yggdrasil is in West Virginia, and everyone knows, as every school child learns, Yggdrasil, the world tree, is absolutely in West Virginia. Kate says on Twitter, don't count Alaska. We are not part of the weight and balance of America. We are the hashtag last frontier. I like that very much, Kate. I want very much to visit Alaska. It speaks to me as a frontier that is attached to the rest of this great continent. Yes, I'm absolutely charmed and really interested in Alaskan art too. There's a lot of great music and great writing, great poetry that comes out of Alaska. So I think that's true oftentimes of frontiers. And of course, perhaps it's absurd to refer to the entirety of Alaska as the frontier. I'm sure that it is, Anchorage and Juneau, I'm sure, are very settled and beautiful cities that are basically indistinguishable from any Midwestern city. But nonetheless, there is a spirit, I think, in my readings of Alaska, of the frontier, and that communicates to me, yeah. Becca asks, could the original Odin be speaking? Perhaps. Again, I don't want to explore that too fully because we're going to get another perspective on how this whole thing works toward the end of the book. And that's going to allow us to look back at this with a little more purpose, a little more intent right there at the end of the book. Let me call up my notes again here so I can continue to move forward because Becca says Alaskan food is the best. I have no idea about Alaskan food besides, I guess, fish, right? A lot of fishing up there, which sounds pretty good to me. I'm into that. Sure. Okay, so we'll extend the Midwest road trip to include Alaska. That seems trivial. We can definitely do that. I'm not sure that we can really talk about. I'm not sure that we can really talk about American gods. I'm not sure that we can talk about this aggregate mythology of America without visiting at least the Pacific Northwest. That seems vital to me. And possibly even California. Okay, I guess we're just going to have to go everywhere, you guys. Okay, sign up over at insert fake URL here. For the year-long American Gods road trip. It'll be great. Okay, let's keep pushing on. Because we revisit here an old friend, someone I mentioned earlier that we have been kind of reframing Shadow's experience. We had that brief flash of who he was before prison, and we're pulling back to his prison experience as we have throughout the entire book. the prison experience is where Shadow goes for reassurance. When he is looking for a moral lesson, when he is looking for a guideline that he can follow, he goes to his prison experience. And that, it turns out, is not straightforward. The driver used a Bic disposable lighter, and it was in the yellow light of the flame that Shadow saw the man's face, actually saw it for the first time, and recognized him, and began to understand. Shadow knew that thin face. He knew that there would be close cropped orange hair beneath the black driver's cap, cut close to the scalp like the embers of a fire. He knew that when the man's lips smiled, they would crease into a network of rough scars. "You're looking good, big guy," said the driver. "Loki?" Shadow stared at his old cellmate warily. Prison friendships are good things. They get you through bad places and through dark times. But a prison friendship ends at the prison gates. And a prison friend who reappears in your life is at best a mixed blessing. "Jesus. Low-key Lysmith," said Shadow. Then he heard what he was saying and he understood. "Loki," he said. "Loki Lysmith." "You're slow," said Loki, "but you get there in the end." And his lips twisted into a crooked smile, and embers danced in the shadows of his eyes. We were laughing a lot when we were covering the TV show, Elizabeth, Daphne, and I, when we were talking about the character of Loki Lysmith and how that is a pun that does not work in an audio format. It works written on the page for most readers. I think most readers will be gratified by the pun, by the simple sleight of hand disguise that gets us to this reveal at the turning point of the entire book. But in an audio medium, whether you're listening to the dialogue of a TV show or you are listening to the audiobook of American Gods, it is all but impossible to miss. And this is just one of the ways in which American Gods, I still think, despite my affection for the TV show, I still think is a more comfortable and elegant triumph in the written form. Aaron says, "You're slow, but you get there in the end." I need that on a mug or something. Yes, that could be our new Storms on the Way t-shirt here. Hashtag Storms on the Way. We're slow, but we get there in the end. Yeah. Aaron, you have gigabit internet. That's spectacular. I'm very envious of that for obvious reasons. Becca says, "And Loki is back. I love this joke so much." It is a great, great joke. Yes. And not just a joke. Not something as simple as a pun. Not something as simple as a piece of narrative sleight of hand. This isn't just Gaiman demonstrating his cleverness. We're not there yet. Well, we're slow, but we'll get there in the end. There is more to come from Loki. But even in this moment, we are backtracking Shadow's experience and we are finding these points of inflection. We're not sure now where Shadow's origin story really started. When we meet him in the book, days before leaving prison, he seems to have, I keep using this phrase because it seems to be completely relevant and seems to be something with which Gaiman in which Gaiman is primarily interested. But when we meet Shadow at the beginning, though we don't have a sense of his history, he seems to have that continuity of experience. He seems to have that long memory. He is the product of his experience. He is explicitly, particularly within the frame of prison, the product of his experience. And though we've had some suggestions that that isn't entirely true, we've had some suggestions about the mystery of his childhood, the oddness of his childhood, and now this odd glimpse of him laughing at a bumper sticker prior to going to prison, we are pulling back and back and back our understanding of who Shadow Moon really is. Now we know that he was under the influence of the gods, or at least in the company of the gods, and though Loki denies it, I don't know how fully I believe the idea that Loki and Wednesday weren't at least aware of one another. It seems like a hell of a coincidence, doesn't it, that two Norse gods are so closely tied at this particular time in Shadow's life. So I'm not sure that I believe Loki's reassurance even, on a superficial reading. But here we see that Shadow has been manipulated by gods long before finding out the truth about Laura, finding out the truth about Robbie, leaving prison, falling in with Wednesday. This has been brewing for a long time. The storm has been coming. Yeah, good. I did want to talk too about, in our discussion, our excitement of the geographical center of America and what that means representationally. I guess I kind of skipped over an open question. Why is the geographical center of America? Okay, firstly, this is not the geographical center of America. Fine. We get this acknowledged in the text, that the story that is told is more important than the actual truth. doesn't matter that the quote-unquote geographical center of America trademark is not the actual geographical center of America, because that's in the middle of a hog farm, okay? Doesn't matter, because the story is what matters. Why, then, is this spot the geographical center of America? Why is it neutral ground? Why are the gods powerless here? What are we to make of that? What are we to make of the fact that it is abandoned? Is it abandoned because it's untrue? Well, that doesn't seem likely. Many, many things are untrue. Many, many things are simple confections and yet still have a power to them. The roadside attraction, spirit of America doesn't require truth. It requires audacity. The house on the rock isn't, in a fundamental sense, true. It's brilliant. It's brave. It's foolish and willful. Those are the virtues that we admire. So why is the center of America not that? Why is it a failure? And is there a connection between the failure of the story of the center of America and the relative powerlessness of the gods here? In what way exactly is it like a minefield, as Chernobog describes it? What is happening here? The metaphor that I keep coming back to, I suppose, and it's appropriate that I should come back to this metaphor, is, of course, the storm. Because the center of America, in a very real sense, is going to be the eye of the hurricane. Because this is not a storm that comes in that sense, that the storm of belief and faith is not something that passes. The war is the storm that comes. The war is the storm that hopefully passes after destroying everything in its path. But the storm of belief, focused here on the center of America, would leave perhaps an eye of godlessness. Loki will describe this later as this godless place. We'll have that word crop up a few times. What does that mean? Why is this a godless place? Is it that the story failed and so no one is here to believe? Well, gods don't seem to be so geographically limited as all that. We're capable of traveling to places where we are not, natively believed, or are not natively worshipped, I suppose would be a more accurate way of putting that. And yet this place is special. Let me see here. This entire story, says Becca, is one big coin trick, and I adore the peeling back of the layers. Yes, yes. Jonathan says, I don't think it's that they don't have power, it's that all their power is literally balanced. It's an interesting idea, Jonathan. I like that very much. Princess Ostrich says, there is an idea that it's tough to survive as a god in America, so this is as far from the niche where they can survive as it can be. Huh. Possibly. That's interesting too, yeah. Because energetically, says Skipa, it has the opposite of ley lines, because it was a failure. Because it was a failure as an idea, it negates any energy that could have been pulled here. Or, arguably, Skipa, it was a failure of an idea because of that absence of ley line energy. Possibly. We do make the connection between ley lines and roadside attractions, but I'm not sure that we ever really sell that, and we seem to overshadow that with the idea of the story. Certainly that suggests, the house on the rock is the story that triumphed, yeah. And Princess Ostrich says, middle of nowhere, just the land around you, very far from subcultures. Again, possibly true, but very far from all subcultures? Would Technical Boy and media be as disempowered? Would Loki be as disempowered here in this place? Would Loki, of all people, here in this place that was built as a monument to something that isn't true, would Loki, of all gods, be disempowered here? He seems to be. I'm not sure why the center of America is as important as it is, but any of those, all of those may well be the case. All right. We really have to wrap up here. So we're going to skip over media and Technical Boy coming to Shadow, basically variations on a scene that we've had before. Technical Boy is particularly wretched, though it is very difficult to feel bad for him. We get an account from Shadow here. Shadow feels bad for the Technical Boy. I, personally, do not, because I remember what happened to Bilquis. That's just me, though. That's my, I'm perhaps not as forgiving as Shadow. I know more about Technical Boy, too. We come together here in this godless place, said Loki, to pass on the body of this individual to those who will dispose of it properly according to the rites. If anyone would like to say something, say it now. Not me, said Town. I never properly met the guy, and this whole thing makes me feel uncomfortable. Chernobog said, these actions will have consequences. You know that. This can only be the start of it all. The fat kid started to giggle a high-pitched, girlish noise. He said, okay, I got it. And then all on one note, he recited, turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer, things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And then he broke off, his brow creasing. He said, shit, I used to know that whole thing. And then he rubbed his temples and made a face and was quiet. And then they were all looking at Shadow. The wind was screaming now. He didn't know what to say. He said, "This whole thing is pitiful. Half of you killed him or had a hand in his death. Now you're giving us his body? Great. He was an irascible old fuck, but I drank his meat and I'm still working for him. That's all." Media said, "In a world where people die every day, I think the important thing to remember is that for each moment of sorrow we get when people leave the world, there's a corresponding moment of joy when a new baby comes into this world. That first wail is, well, it's magic, isn't it? Perhaps it's a hard thing to say, but joy and sorrow are like milk and cookies. That's how well they go together. I think we should all take a moment and meditate on that." And Mr. Nancy cleared his throat and said, "So, I gotta say it because no one else here will. We're at the center of this place. A land that has no time for gods, and here at the center of it, less time for us than anywhere. It's a no man's land, a place of truce, and we observe our truces here. We have no choice. So, you give us the body of our friend, we accept it. You will pay for this. Murder for murder. Blood for blood." Nancy has to declare war because Shadow won't. Shadow isn't fighting the war. Shadow is working for Wednesday. He was an irascible old fuck, but I drank his meat and I'm still working for him. That's all. And by the way, of all the things that the technical boy has done so far, invoking the second coming and doing so badly is the worst thing, perhaps. But this, of course, is, for those of you who may not know, this is The Second Coming by W.B. Yeats. This was published in 1919, written in 1919, published in 1920. And it is basically the recitation of Christian imagery regarding the apocalypse and the second coming of Christ. This is the poem that ends very famously with, "And what rough beast its hour come round at last slouches toward Bethlehem to be born." This is, Christian allegory for the apocalypse. This is a great poem, an absolutely great poem. It is the kind of thing that the technical boy would have learned in high school, which presumably is why, in metaphorical high school, because he represents the internet and is thus emblematic on some level of high school. This is exactly the kind of poem that he would learn and has now forgotten. He is, good Lord, the worst. But here we get this detente, media's awful, saccharine newsreader presentation of joy and sorrow are like milk and cookies. That's how well they go together. That's awful. All of these characters right now are just being the worst, except Shadow. He's the one who's focused. He's the only one who's actually personally connected to Wednesday. "In a godless place," says Nicole, "said the god in a room full of gods mourning the death of a god." Becca Eller says, "Media, I adore you, but shut up." Yes, and Aaron says media would absolutely use the phrase "in a world" all the time. Such perfect dialogue. No, the dialogue here for media is absolutely pitch perfect, as it so always is. As it so always is. Yes, good. Good, all right. We are running very short on time, and we still have 2 slides to get to. So this is the wake. This is the return of the body, essentially. This is the handing over, this uneasy truce here at the center of America, though we know the war is coming. Shadow here is not engaged in the war. Shadow turns his back on the war and turns instead toward Wednesday. Why does he do that? Well, he drank the mead. They had a compact. This was the deal. All of these things are true, and yet these things are not entirely true. Later, Nancy said, "The person on the vigil gets tied to the tree, just like Wednesday was, and then they hang there for 9 days and 9 nights, no food, no water, all alone. At the end, they cut the person down, and if they lived, well, it could happen, and Wednesday will have had his vigil." Chernobog said, "Maybe Elvis will send us one of his people. A dwarf could survive it." "I'll do it," said Shadow. "No," said Mr. Nancy. "Yes," said Shadow. The 2 old men were silent. Then Nancy said, "Why?" "Because it's the kind of thing a living person would do," said Shadow. "You're crazy," said Chernobog. "Maybe. But I'm going to hold Wednesday's vigil." Ultimately, what defines Shadow's fate is his desire to be alive. What forces Shadow to confront death. 9 days and 9 nights hanging from the branches of Yggdrasil, honoring this vigil for Wednesday. This irascible old fuck who was difficult to get along with at the best of times. What drives Shadow toward his own death is his desire for life. And this, of course, it is absolutely impossible to disentangle from the last conversation that he had with Laura, the conversation in which Laura tells him that he is not alive, not dead, but not really alive either. He has never embraced his vitality. He has never realized that essence, at least not in Laura's experience, and certainly not now. And crucially, one of the things that has been lost from Shadow in this moment is that spark of life, is that spark of identity and of essence here. He lost Mike Ainsel, and in that loss seems to have been untethered, seems to have lost his way a little bit. And now he needs to prove and to assert his life, vibrancy, agency, autonomy, selfhood, personhood. He has to actualize his humanity by doing this noble, selfless, ridiculous thing. He has to, in part, believe. And his belief in Wednesday now is beyond any question. Yeah. Good, good. Yes, Becca observes, the women in this book are some of the most beautifully sculpted characters ever. I completely agree with you. Yes, good. All right, let's push on then to our last slide here as we climb the steps to the World Tree. In the company, by the way, of the Norns, we're told that they are familiar to Shadow, that they feel like the Zariahs, which of course they would because they're kind of part of a similar cultural tradition. But the Norns, there were always three Norns, are basically the Zariahs of Norse myth. And here they are in the shadow of Yggdrasil, helping to, well, suspend Shadow. He climbed the 9 steps. Then, at their urging, he stepped onto a low branch. The middle woman tipped out the contents of the sack onto the meadow grass. It was filled with a tangle of thin ropes, brown with age and dirt, and the woman began to sort them out into lengths and to lay them carefully on the ground beside Wednesday's body. They climbed their own ladders now, and they began to knot the ropes, intricate and elegant knots, and they wrapped the ropes first about the tree and then about Shadow. Unembarrassed, like midwives or nurses or those who lay out corpses, they removed his t-shirt and briefs. Then they bound him, never tightly, but firmly and finally. He was amazed at how comfortably the ropes and the knots bore his weight. The ropes went under his arms, between his legs, around his waist, his ankles, his chest, binding him to the tree. The final rope was tied loosely about his neck. It was initially uncomfortable, but his weight was well distributed, and none of the ropes cut his flesh. His feet were 5 feet above the ground. The tree was leafless and huge, its branches black against the gray sky, its bark a smooth, silvery gray. They took the ladders away. There was a moment of panic as he dropped a few inches. As all his weight was taken by the ropes, he made no sound. He was entirely naked by that point. The women placed the body wrapped in its motel sheet shroud at the foot of the tree, and they left him there. They left him there, alone. We are going to conclude there, I think, because we're going to come back around to talk about the vigil, to talk about his suspension in the branches of Yggdrasil next week in the next session. We're going to, I think, be able to talk about this entire experience with a little more care and a little more acuity after it is over. So let's put a pin in this discussion until next week. It is just beautiful, though, and touching and dark and disturbing, but also valiant in its way, which is, of course, something that we will associate with Shadow. Okay, we are over time, so let me call up this last slide here. Our next session, Tuesday, July the 18th, 2017. That is, for those of you keeping track at home, next Tuesday, 9 p.m. Eastern, for chapters 15 and 16, as we find out what happened to Shadow as he hung in the branches of Yggdrasil, and he is reunited once again with Laura. A lot to talk about, you guys. Thank you all so much for joining me here today. This has been a really fun session. I know that we've moved very swiftly, and I know that there's doubtless stuff that I've missed in this discussion that you would have liked me to call out, but we are picking up the pace here, and I think that even at this accelerated pace, these have been just fantastic chapters, and now I urge you all to go and read Sam's monologue again. Just go do that thing. It's fantastic. And anyone who wants to record themselves reading it and put that up on the internet, I am super into that idea. Hashtag Tipsy Sam's monologue, maybe. We could do that thing. Be a lot of fun. All right, that is going to do it for this week on Storms on the Way. If you enjoyed the work that we do here at Point North Media and would like more of it, or you would like this internet video quality to be better, head on over to patreon.com/pointnorthmedia and pledge your support, $1 a month or whatever you can afford. And I know that sometimes $1 a month doesn't feel like it's a lot. Sometimes $1 a month feels like it's a ton. Every single dollar helps the work that we do here at Point North Media, helps me take the time to produce these seminars, helps pay for the significant hosting fees and website fees and service fees for all the software that I use to produce this stuff. Every single dollar is welcomed and appreciated. You are all supporters, patrons of the arts, and this would be impossible without you. Thank you so much for listening today. I will talk to you all again very soon. Until then,